The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision, for the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. However, that is very clumsily put and sounds more self-important than I feel. For as a matter of fact, I have consciously planned very little, and should chiefly be grateful for having been brought up since I was 8, in a faith that has taught me all the little that I know. That is a direct quote from J.R.R. Tolkien, and it is in the book I will be talking to you about today, Tolkien, A Spiritual Biography, written by Holly Ordway and published relatively recently in 2023 by Word on Fire. So first, why Tolkien? You and I have talked about the value of learning from saints and their heroic virtue and how we can learn things from their lives and apply them to our own, but Tolkien is not a canonized saint. He did, however, create one of the most famous fiction universes and write some of the best fiction novels in the 20th century in the Lord of the Rings series and The Hobbit. But many people do not know that he was Catholic, let alone self-describe his beloved stories as, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. And after reading this book, there are certainly many examples of heroic virtue in his life as an academic, as a devoted man to his family, and as a Catholic. And I think that there's many things that we can learn from and apply to our own lives. So back to the book. He is born John Ronald Reuel Tolkien in January 1892 in South Africa and was baptized at the Anglican Cathedral of St. Andrew and St. Michael. Like many of the saints and holy people you and I have learned about, Tolkien experiences hardship and adversity very early on in his life. And when Tolkien was 4, his mom took him back to Birmingham, England to get out of the hot weather in South Africa with full plans to return. But they received a telegram on February 15th, 1896, that Arthur Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's father, was seriously ill, probably with typhoid, and died the following day. He never saw his father or South Africa again. So now Tolkien is back in England with his mother and his brother, and his mother's a widow. And I would like to put a pin in our story here and cover a bit of historical context and background it's going to be extremely relevant as we explore Tolkien's life and his faith. So Tolkien was baptized Anglican. Anglicans are a Christian denomination that traces its history back to the 1500s and King Henry VIII in England. This is a quote from the book. King Henry VIII had previously been such a staunch Catholic that the Pope had given him the title Defender of the Faith. However, when it transpired that his wife Catherine of Aragon could not bear him a son, Henry sought to have the marriage annulled. The Pope refused Henry's request to declare the marriage with Catherine null, and he declined to recognize the legitimacy of his new proposed wife. In response, Henry overthrew the papal authority and declared himself the head of the Church of England, and thus Anglicanism was born. So the reason this context is critical to understand is because it starts a chain of events. It starts a history of persecution of Catholics in England as they're seen as a threat to English sovereignty, and this continues well into Tolkien's day. And just 60 years before Tolkien is born, the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1820 allows Catholics to be members of the parliament and to work as civil servants and to vote. So just relatively recently to Tolkien's birth, they're given full voting rights, and that does not even stop the persecution that continues well into Tolkien's day. So in describing what it was like to have been Catholic during this time and place at the end of the 19th century, historian Edward Norman put it, "Ignorance of Catholic doctrines, a sensationalized popular literature about Catholic practices, a political tradition of civil liberty which associated Catholicism with autocracy, treason, and intellectual enslavement, all tended to foster a widespread dislike. Some would even express it as a loathing of the Roman Church. Lord Ripon, a former cabinet minister and a friend of the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, converted to Catholicism, and the Times newspaper declared that he had lost the confidence of the English people, for to become a Roman Catholic and remain a thorough Englishman are, it cannot be disguised, almost incompatible conditions." And to this day, the monarch is still not allowed to be Catholic, but as of 2013, they now are permitted to marry one. So what does this have to do with Tolkien and his upbringing? Well, his mother Mabel was received into the Catholic Church in June 1900, and immediately financial support from her brother-in-law is cut off and sends the family into relative poverty. So as the opening quote from Tolkien alluded to, he is brought up in the Catholic Church from age 8, and this is because his mother makes this extremely unpopular and difficult choice to pursue truth and convert to Catholicism despite the ramifications. And this will be the environment that Tolkien grows up in and is formed by. So the family ultimately ends up joining a parish called the Oratory, founded by St. John Henry Newman, and this will drastically alter Tolkien's life. So the mission of the Oratorians is to serve the highly educated in the community, emphasize outreach and evangelization through the beauty of liturgy and music, and through the sacrament of reconciliation. Many of the Oratory fathers themselves had personally known or were taught by John Henry Newman, thereby having a large impact on Ronald. So this is the environment, the intellectual community that Tolkien is embedded in. It's focused on the sacrament of reconciliation, which we'll see throughout Tolkien's life. It's focused on the beauty of the liturgy and the music, and I think this has a profound impact on Tolkien and what he chooses to study, and then ultimately his work. Additionally, I think it's important to note here that as you and I learn more and read more about saints and holy people, there are usually recurring people and themes that pop up throughout these books, and they have a profound impact on the saint or that holy person. And John Henry Newman is one of those people for Tolkien. He has a profound impact on how Tolkien is brought up and ultimately how his life ends up. One of the clergy at the Oratory commented that Ronald had read far too much for a boy under 15, and he doesn't have a single classical thing to recommend him. This is one of my favorite biographical motifs to highlight as we go through these books and analyze these saints and holy people, is that we constantly see that there's this intense hunger for reading and an innate curiosity to learn. And that is why you and I are on this endeavor as well. We want to learn as much as we possibly can from these people and then apply them to our own lives. And it's really cool to see the same spirit within Tolkien. However, tragedy strikes again early on in Tolkien's life as his mother Mabel dies from diabetes in November 1904. Tolkien was only 12 years old. Tolkien wrote, "My own dear mother was a martyr indeed, and it is not to everybody that God grant so easy a way to his gifts as he did to Hilary and myself." Hilary is his brother. "Giving us a mother who killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith." So what he's saying is that she took on so much stress and so much anxiety and work in converting and having some of her support cut off, that she was essentially to him a martyr, that she did this for the truth, for her faith. And this is the example that is set for Tolkien and his brother. So now orphaned, Tolkien's mother had arranged for Father Francis Morgan of the Oratory to be the guardian of the two boys. Father Francis had John Henry Newman as a teacher in his youth and was an avid reader and had a room crammed full of books, which of course has a profound impact on Tolkien. So as Tolkien grows up at King Edward's School, he makes 4 very good friends where they found the Tea Club Barovian Society, or the TCBS, and this is in describing the TCBS. Humor was quickfire and often sophisticated. Their interests and talents were many, ranging from playing rugby to debating in English and Latin, reading poetry, and performing plays in Greek verse. The TCBS also had a morally serious side, which would grow stronger as they went up through the ranks of King Edward's and then departed for university. The quartet called themselves the Immortal Four. Their aim was to reestablish sanity, cleanliness, and the love of real and true beauty in everyone's breast. Tolkien declared that their destiny was to testify for God and truth. That does not sound like typical teenagers, but again highlights the types of peers that Tolkien is surrounded by and who he is formed by. And this is so important as we think about, who are we surrounding ourselves with? Are we surrounding ourselves with people who are pushing us to, quote, reestablish sanity, cleanliness, and the love of real and true beauty? Those are the type of people that you want to surround yourself with. So Tolkien meets his wife Edith when they are both orphans and they reside in the same home. They end up falling in love, and she is all that young Ronald can think about. He is forced to not see her for 3 years until he is 21 by Father Francis Morgan because he fears it is a youthful fling and won't be positive for Tolkien. Ultimately, he is accepted into Oxford with a scholarship in 1911, and this is a quote from the book. Oxford, like the rest of England, was firmly Protestant and anti-Catholic, and until recently before Ronald's attendance, Catholics were not even allowed to attend, and once they were able to attend, had to get special permission from their bishop. Despite this, he graduates in 4 years with a first-class honors degree in English language and literature, a brilliant achievement. And as soon as Tolkien turns 21 and the 3 years is up in 1913, he wrote Edith telling her that he still loved her and that he wanted to marry her, saying, "How long will it be before we can be joined together before God and the world?" When she wrote back, her news was stunning. She was engaged to be married to another man. Undaunted, Tolkien wrote back and they agreed to meet. Tolkien convinced Edith to break off her engagement and then proposed marriage to her, and she accepted. During the next 18 months of their engagement, Tolkien finished his studies at Oxford and then bolted into the army in the summer of 1915, and as soon as he had his degree under his belt. On Wednesday, March 22nd, 1916, Tolkien and Edith were quietly married after the morning mass at St. Mary Immaculate. Tolkien was 24. On Sunday, June 4th, Tolkien boarded his train, beginning his journey to the Western Front and France to fight as an officer in World War I. Continuing quote from the book, "At the front, he would receive communion and go to confession and mass as often as he could, although it was extremely difficult. 2 members of the TCBS were killed within their first year, Jeffrey Smith and Rob Gilson. By 1918, as Tolkien wrote, years later, all but one of my close friends were dead. Jeffrey Smith wrote a letter to Tolkien right before a nighttime raid across no man's land before he was killed." And this is a quote directly from that letter. "Death can make us loathsome and helpless as individuals, but it cannot put an end to the immortal four. Yes, publish. You, I am sure, are chosen, like Saul among the children of Israel. May God bless you, my dear John Ronald, and may you say the things I have tried to say long after I am not there to say them, if such be my lot." That gives me the chills. Wow, this is prophetic, it's noble, it's beautiful. Tolkien makes sure his sacrifice and others are not in vain as he goes on to change the world with his work. This is so important. So throughout this suffering, however, Tolkien maintains his faith, and this is due in part to several reasons. This is back to the book. For soldiers to identify themselves as Catholic, part of a socially marginalized minority, faith was an active assertion, not a default social position. The Anglican soldier, Guy Chapman, complained that the Church of England chaplains had nothing to offer but the consolation the next man could give you, and a less fortifying one. The Church of Rome sent a man into action mentally and spiritually cleansed. The Church of England could only offer you a cigarette. Tolkien was sent back to England after having to go to a French hospital in October 1916 with a very serious case of trench fever, and ultimately the Great War ends very shortly after in November 1918. So now back in post-war England, he accepts a position at the University of Leeds in the north of England, taking up the readership in English language, and in 1925 accepts the chair of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. And he starts his family. John is born in 1917, who goes on to become a priest. Michael is born in 1920. Christopher is born in 1924. And Priscilla is born in 1929. His children were, and this is how he thought of his children and described them, his children were immortal souls in his care, not just his, but God's, entrusted to him for his care. So at Oxford is where the famous relationship with fellow author and Professor C.S. Lewis begins. Tolkien famously goes on a walk with Lewis one night, and it has a profound impact on his conversion to Christianity. And C.S. Lewis goes on to become the famous apologist, writing famous books like Mere Christianity. So the conversation centered around that Lewis was prepared to see the profound symbolic meaning in pagan stories, but that he wasn't willing to see that in his own faith tradition and that same symbolic truth in the biblical stories. He began to see that Christianity was primarily a story, not a system of thought, and that it had to be approached with the same imaginative embrace that enabled him to enjoy myths in general. The tremendous difference Lewis realized was that the Christian story was historical. It was a true myth. Indeed, it was the true myth. It really happened. Or as Tolkien put it, in the Gospels, art has been verified. Legend and history have met and fused. So World War II starts in Europe in 1939, and two of his sons, Michael and Christopher, serve in the war. And during this time, he demonstrates his commitment to truth as he stood up firmly against anti-Semitism. As a German publisher of The Hobbit sent a request asking if he was Aryan or not. So this is just an example of the type of man that he was. And a quote from the book. Tolkien was having none of it. And this is his response to the German publisher. If I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. I cannot, however, forbear to comment if impertinent and irrelevant inquiries of this sort are to become the rule in matters of literature, then the time is not far distant when the German name will no longer be a source of pride. So he is potentially turning down revenue, money that he could be making from The Hobbit, because he is a man of principles, because he stands up for truth. And the persecution of the Jewish people during this time, especially in Germany, was severe. So during his career at Oxford, he helps to form a now infamous group that met twice weekly called the Inklings. It included C.S. Lewis and other scholars and writers, and they met from the 1930s until Lewis's death in 1963. This group would come together essentially and share their work and receive criticism. A quote from the book here says, "Whatever the internal tensions of the group, its fruitfulness and its long-term cultural impact cannot be denied, for it was only Lewis's endless encouragement of Tolkien, driven at times to the point of nagging, that convinced him that there would be an audience for the new Hobbit, i.e. the Lord of the Rings. And since that epic work would go on to acquire a reputation as one of the greatest literary products of the 20th century, the importance of the Inklings as a testing ground or incubator, and of Lewis in particular as a literary midwife, can hardly be overestimated." I think that this is one of the most important lessons that you and I can learn from this book and Tolkien's life. And it makes me think of this term, this idea in nuclear physics, a term called critical mass. And critical mass designates the minimum threshold of material needed that will produce a nuclear chain reaction. This concept can be directly applied to Tolkien's literary work, and it is the same in your and I's life work as well. We must constantly surround ourselves with people like the Inklings that are all working towards being their best, that are working on their life's work, so that we can reach this point of critical mass, this inflection point where we achieve this metaphorical nuclear chain reaction in our own work. And if our goal is to become a saint, then we must surround ourselves with other people striving for the same mission to create that nuclear fission. However, we have to brace ourselves, because whenever we set out to pursue our life's work or to do something challenging like to become a saint or to change the literary world in Tolkien's case, we will undoubtedly face fierce criticism and pushback. And this is why it is paramount that we have at least one person in our life that says something to the effect of, "I love you, I believe in you, and you are not crazy." And this person for Tolkien was C.S. Lewis. And there's a really cool example that I want to highlight here and of why this is so important. So Dyson, which is one of the members of the Inklings, and this is a quote from the book, disliked Tolkien's work and did not keep his views to himself. He took to exercising an effective veto on any reading of The Lord of the Rings at the Inklings meetings, and often vetoed in an aggressive manner. On at least one occasion, when Tolkien pulled out a manuscript chapter and prepared to read, Dyson, who had been lolling about on a nearby sofa, shouted, "Oh God, not another effing elf." If Tolkien had listened to critics like this and he didn't have people like C.S. Lewis around him encouraging him, then we may never have one of the greatest literary works of the 20th century. So what does this teach us? We have to be confident in ourselves and in our own faith, in what we are doing and in our life's work, that regardless of persecution, we are going to pursue it no matter what, and we are going to achieve the greatness that God has destined for each and every one of us. So now let's turn to some of the simple demonstrations of his faith and how he lived his life, and then also how some aspects of his faith appear in his work. This is a quote from the book. Tolkien was dedicated to the sacrament of confession and always liked to go to confession before receiving communion, even inquiring if he would be able to go to confession while visiting friends over Sunday. Writing to his son Michael in 1941, he declared, "Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth, and more than that, death, by the divine paradox, that which ends life and demands the surrender of all, and yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can you seek in your relationships, love, faithfulness, and joy be maintained. Or take on that complexion of reality, eternal endurance, which every man's heart desires." And this is just an anecdotal evidence, additionally pointing to his reverence of the Blessed Sacrament. He would raise his hat whenever he passed a church as a sort of genuflection to our Lord in the tabernacle. So in talking about her father, his daughter Priscilla wrote, "Though I am profoundly aware of my father's piety and faith, I do not remember him ever intent on speaking of dogma or doctrines in intellectual or abstract terms. I do not think it was ever in his heart to write or speak of religion didactically. His was to express religious themes and moral questions through the medium of storytelling." This takes us now to a couple examples of his stories set in Middle-earth and some of the symbolism of his Catholic faith. Symbolically, the Lembas elvish bread in The Lord of the Rings has exceptional nourishing properties, but it is not physically different if there is a scientific analysis done on it, just like the Eucharist. Tolkien recognizes that the story function of Lembas is to make it plausible that the characters can go on such long journeys with so little present provision of food, but that aspect, he says, is relatively unimportant. Its real significance, he explains, appears in the Mount Doom chapter, in which we learn that Frodo and Sam would long ago have lied down to die without this waybread, which fed their will and gave them strength to endure beyond the measure of mortal kind. So clearly the Lembas elvish bread has very clear symbolic ties to the Eucharist. And then in Return of the King, Éowyn and her role in killing the Witch King's flying steed, the Nazgul, is very resonant of Mary's role in defeating Satan, classically imaged as her crushing the serpent's head. And it is very similar to this image that we see in The Lord of the Rings. The quote from the book says, "The outstretched neck she clove asunder, and the hewn head fell like a stone." So as Tolkien ages, he lives through the Second Vatican Council in the mid-1960s, and this presents a cross for him to bear and also demonstrates some of his heroic virtue. It lets us see into how he handled stress and things that he disagreed with. This is a quote from the book. "He sadly lamented the loss of the Latin Mass and all that implied. Tolkien felt the reforms to be misguided and unnecessary. Tolkien once described the church to his son as dying but living, corrupt but holy, self-reforming and re-arising. He did not speak publicly about these disagreements, however, with a deep love and respect for the church being fundamental. I think there is nothing to do but to pray for the church, the vicar of Christ, and for ourselves, and meanwhile to exercise the virtue of loyalty, which indeed only becomes a virtue when one is under pressure to desert it." So despite his love for the Latin Mass, the Latin language in which he was fluent, and everything else he was disappointed in with the changes during Vatican II, he remained loyal and prayed steadfastly for the church and himself, when perhaps the easy thing for him to do would have been to reject it or abandon his faith. I think points to his holiness. And towards the end of Tolkien's life, his wife Edith, of 55 years, dies in November 1971 at 82 years old. And just a couple years later, in September of 1973, he is hospitalized with a bleeding ulcer that was then complicated by a chest infection and dies at the age of 81. And his funeral mass was celebrated by his son, the priest, Father John. So that is where I will leave it for now. Again, this was from the book Tolkien, A Spiritual Biography by Holly Ordway. If you would like to purchase the book and to read it for yourself, I would highly recommend it. There is much more included that I do not cover here. And if you would like to purchase the book and support the podcast at the same time, you can use the link in the description of the podcast. Thank you, and Deo gratias.